Even as the stakes for succeeding in education get higher and higher every year, we're still choosing a mode of teaching that we know only works well for a minority of our children, and it's killing us. It's time to start talking about the most revolutionary option on the table: unleashing our superpower.
Nothing, absolutely nothing, approaches the effectiveness of tutoring.
Tutoring's unlike most educational approaches in that we have a lot of good research on its effectiveness.
Tutoring, lots and lots of tutoring. That is going to put them way, way ahead.
Welcome to Tutoring the Human Superpower. I'm Giles Leeper. Humans are really good at learning. We're really good at social learning, actually, learning from people. Our big brains would be big problems for us if we weren't able to fill them with useful skills and habits and values and knowledge. Our ability to learn so much is one of the main things that sets us apart from other animals. So why does schooling seem so hard?
In reading, just 33% of fourth graders were proficient or above.
54% of American adults between the ages of 16 and 74 read below a sixth grade level.
Only 26% of eighth graders were proficient or above in math.
No matter what we do, the No Child Left Behind Act, charter schools, the Every Student Succeeds Act, testing kids more and more, nothing seems to really get better, not even the test scores. There's no clear evidence that our children today are any smarter than they were 50 years ago. Even the tiny gains we've seen among fourth and eighth graders disappear by the time those kids turn 17. So why is this so hard? One explanation I used to believe was that poverty and social inequality and the toxic stresses that those create are the main problem. And of course, it is true that those clearly are associated with poor schooling outcomes. But the story we're going to hear today tells us that there's a problem that's even deeper than that. And it can strike us all, no matter how privileged our socioeconomic status is. In fact, depending on how you look at it, the poor performance of children growing up in poverty might just be a more obvious symptom of this deeper and larger problem that affects us all. The problem is the delicate fragility of the whole classroom teaching system. There are just so many things that can go wrong with it, and they do go wrong. It doesn't have to be trauma or poverty to derail a child's education. Disaster can strike a child growing up in an upper middle class white neighborhood with two married parents who both have master's degrees. The big difference, as we'll see in the story, is the power that some people have more than others to respond when disaster strikes. Before I continue, I just want to acknowledge that as I talk about unleashing our superpower, I have not really addressed the elephant in the room: money, the cost of tutoring. Having started and led 3 schools that are actually all still operating, I assure you that I am aware that we live in a real world with real financial limits. I have thought hard about the cost of tutoring, and I have a lot to say about its affordability. And if you stay tuned, I promise to address these concerns head on. But today we're addressing it in a more indirect, more narrative approach as we learn about the cost one family paid for tutoring when it was really needed. My guests today are Jeremy and Isaiah Lewis. Isaiah is in public high school now and has become a very successful student. But when he started first grade, things looked bad.
It started to weigh down on me a lot. And there was actually a lot of just nights where I would just cry with my dad because it was so sad. I had never experienced something like that where I didn't feel like I was enough.
Things started going off course for Isaiah when his parents, Jeremy and Beth, found that they could not get Isaiah into their local public pre-K. Here's Jeremy.
We actually were looking for options, but we were still planning to go to the local school. So I actually went up to Laurel Ridge Elementary for the day of the lottery, and our name was not on the list. I went up to the administrator who was there and said, so, what does this actually mean? Like, what do we do next? And she said, well, you go to kindergarten next. And I was like, well, so what about pre-K? And she just said, well, you didn't get into the lottery thing. I said, well, what happens to people who can't, pay for that? She says, well, they show up to school for kindergarten, and that's the beginning of their education. And that was my beginning of realizing, holy cow, our system is messed up. So that actually led us to, well, Waldorf, which was, what did you think about that experience?
I loved Waldorf. It was probably like the dream school for me to go to. I enjoyed every part of that school. Like,
How did it start off? Like, how did the day begin?
we started off by playing in our quote unquote playground, but it was different than like other playgrounds. We were allowed to like dig, do whatever we wanted to,
Swing really high,
swing as high as we wanted to,
jump off
jump
the
off
swings.
structures, get as dirty as we wanted to. So I was always digging with my hands in the dirt.
During pre-K, Isaiah was happy and enjoying himself. So when he became old enough to go to kindergarten at his local public school, his parents figured there was no harm in leaving him for one more year in the Waldorf school. But this was a private school, and obviously it was not free. And their plan was never to stay in private school all the way through Isaiah's education, especially not when they lived in one of the most prestigious public school districts in Georgia. Beth, Isaiah's mother, was a public school teacher in that system. They did not realize that the decision to leave him in that school for just one more year would turn out to be a surprisingly momentous decision. This private school, the Waldorf school, had a very different philosophy from their local public school. In the early years, they were not focused on academics. In their philosophy, that could come later. Young children needed to work on social skills and creativity, imagination, craftsmanship, learning to make healthy choices. Some might call it a holistic focus or a focus on the whole child. But their local public school, Glenwood Elementary, did have a very academic focus even from the youngest grades. And this difference was the source of a lot of stress when Isaiah left Waldorf to go to Glenwood in the first grade.
Since at Waldorf, we didn't learn how to read or write or hadn't been introduced to any stuff like that. When I went to Glenwood, most of those kids had already been exposed to those things. And so when I got to Glenwood, it was the first time that I had felt not as smart as certain other people, but it really wasn't I was not as smart as them. It was that I wasn't as prepared. That really made me feel like, is there something wrong with me? And I remember they put me in certain classes. I thought I had like learning disabilities.
Everything depended upon reading, and so since he couldn't, he was in this group of people who really had some significant learning challenges. And I could tell, like, the more he spent time in them, the more he became kind of identifying with himself as like, well, I guess this is like where I kind of belong. They just hadn't seen someone from that school. And so the only way they could deal with it was like to begin to work with remedial classes to put him in and to try to see if they could catch him up. But it was really challenging emotionally.
The challenges were not purely academic. The Waldorf school and Glenwood also had very different behavioral expectations for kids.
The first day, I got sent to the principal's office. You guys got a note home because I had tried to dig a hole on the school grounds, and they said I couldn't do that. And I was just such a contrast where at Waldorf, I was encouraged to do all stuff. And then
They considered it vandalism, destruction of property.
One of the biggest cultural differences between the two schools had to do with how they dealt with kids who had questions.
At Waldorf, we all talked openly about everything. You could ask questions whenever you wanted to.
But I remember in a parent-teacher conference that shared that, really been working hard to try to help Isaiah not to ask so many questions, raise his hand all the time. And I said, well, that's interesting because that's really how he was taught to learn, is to ask questions. She's like, we just don't have time with 28 kids in the room. We can't get to it. And so as a punishment, she had taken away recess time. And she said, I just want us to be on the same page about this. And I said, well, I can tell you, I'm not at all on the same page about that decision, because that's the one time of day that he currently looks forward to. And so you've just removed the only thing that he is enjoying. And so I would imagine the behavior is going to get worse.
In the very first months of first grade, Isaiah was struggling academically and behaviorally. And this started to take an emotional toll on Isaiah and on his parents.
It was really hard because I knew that I was a really smart kid, and I'd always been told that. I hadn't been taught, and I was already behind, so I was trying to play catch up the whole time. And by being put in those separate classes and being told like, oh, you need to do the separate thing, or no, you can't do this because you don't know how to do it yet, that really just, it started to weigh down on me a lot. And there was actually a lot of just nights where I would just cry with my dad because it was so sad. I had never experienced something like that where I didn't feel um like I was enough, or I was smart enough, accepted.
Yeah, it was a very challenging time. The nighttime ritual of thinking and listening through it and trying to process it, and so that anger didn't emerge as a physical manifestation in the classroom was exhausting, because it was daily. It was not,
Yeah.
Every day.
it was every day.
It was like for 30 to 30 minutes an hour, probably. I had always looked forward to going to school, and now I look forward to going to school. But this one experience was at the time that I did not enjoy going to school.
We had no idea the difference that Waldorf, like taking a couple years at that school, would do in terms of changing the way that you understand the system that you're in.
With Isaiah struggling so much, naturally his parents reached out to his teachers for conferences.
At one point, a teacher did mention that like this system was probably not gonna, like, it wasn't gonna be a good fit for Isaiah, because they knew that he was smart, but like they didn't have a great way of dealing with someone who came there, who was capable but had not developed reading skills. And so, I think that also took some courage for that person to say that. They kind of probably had a plan, but he wasn't the top priority, which is also understandable. Lots of kids in a school, but he's my top priority.
The situation became so stressful and worrisome for Isaiah and his family that Jeremy decided to take drastic measures.
It didn't end up working out for us to stay in the school that year. And so around Thanksgiving is when I took him out of school to homeschool. There was a moment of clarity of like, I can do this and I can make it happen. I was working full time.
You ended up actually resigning, right?
Yeah, as the executive director at that moment. And I just knew like he needed that and he needed us to do something. And it was either now or never.
Late November of that tough year, Jeremy decided to quit his job as an executive director of a nonprofit in order to dedicate all of his energy to homeschooling Isaiah. Beth was still working as a teacher, so they had some income. However,
it was financially a huge change in our household economics.
Jeremy decided it was worth it. It was worth quitting his job and putting his career on hold while he concentrated entirely on his son's education. But was it really now or never? Did he really need to do something? Some listeners may feel like it's important for children to face adversity. Making it through tough times will make them stronger in the long run. Kids not liking school is pretty normal. And not every kid who's struggling gets pulled out of school and homeschooled full-time by their father. Jeremy sensed that a lot was at stake for his son, but maybe he was just being overprotective. This exact situation has not been studied systematically, but there is research that I think can shed some light on this question. There's something called the relative age effect. And if you Google that term, you'll find a whole cottage industry of researchers who are trying to figure out what happens to young children when they are relatively younger for their grade than their peers. Being born in the fall makes kids relatively old for their grade because the cutoff date for starting kindergarten is usually around September 1st. Being born in the summer makes kids relatively young for their grade. In fact, they can be younger than their peers by up to a day less than 1 whole year. Like Isaiah, on day 1, those kids are a little bit behind on just about everything. They're younger. As any parent knows, 1 year of development makes a big difference at that age. Isaiah clearly did feel behind his peers. What does the research say about children who are relatively young compared to their peers when they start school? According to the research, here are some of the surprising things that happen more to kids who are born in the summer than kids who are born in the fall. They're more likely to repeat a grade, more often diagnosed with a disability, more often placed in remedial classes or remedial groups within classes. In the long run, they tend to have lower cognitive skills and social skills. They're more likely to drop out of high school, more likely to be unemployed or underemployed working part-time, and they are more likely to become incarcerated. One study showed that disproportionately fewer of the CEOs of our big corporations are born in the months of June and July. Same for kids getting into Ivy League colleges. Let's just sit with that for a moment. To me, the one that causes my head to spin the most is that there are adults today who are in prison who would not be in prison if only they had been born in the fall rather than the summer. And just because they started school a little behind most of their peers. There are people who would have had higher social and cognitive intelligence if they had been born just a few months later. Even though Isaiah was not necessarily young for his grade, this research tells us 2 important things. First, our current system is fragile. It doesn't take much to make it go off course. And second, when it does go off course, especially for young kids, the effects can be permanent. It seems that real damage is inflicted on young children who feel behind, and it cannot be easily reversed later when the child becomes an adolescent and the age differences are no longer that important. There's no shortage of research on other areas to support these conclusions. For example, Raj Chetty's research on the lifelong effects of having a slightly smaller class size or slightly better teacher in kindergarten and first grade tells a similar story. All the research points in the same direction. Jeremy and Isaiah were dealing with a real threat. Something significant was at stake. They filed the paperwork and removed Isaiah from that school. And in a flash, that whole challenging ordeal was just over for Isaiah.
And my reaction when I heard that was just like, okay. Like, I was excited, but I also I didn't know what homeschooling was going to look like, or if it was going to be worse, or just didn't know, because it was another change.
Yeah, yeah. And we were embarking on it like together, and I didn't necessarily know what it was going to be, but that is something that I do think that my education had provided me, was the confidence to know that I could make big things happen, and that, I didn't necessarily have to be the expert in an area, but I can study and I can learn and I can figure things out, and that people had done this for a long time and I could do that too.
So Jeremy was now fully in charge of his 7-year-old son's education, and he had to figure out what to do. He decided not to go straight into reading instruction, even though that's what had caused so much stress. The more important thing to Jeremy at that time was healing from this sort of traumatic experience with first grade, bring his confidence back up first, and change the way Isaiah felt about education itself.
I had studied asset-based community development, which is the idea that everybody has gifts and talents and abilities, and when you begin to move in development from things that people are good at and care about, people support what they help create. And I was trying to support him in creating his own education with guidance from me. And so we began following things that he was interested in and rediscovering kind of the love of learning. Like the very first week,
we went on hikes.
Yeah.
and I was interested in different like types of rocks and different structures that were just found out in nature. And so we decided we were just gonna go on hikes. We took some books about different species of plants and things and trees, and we went out and identified them. Like, I actually got to decide what we learned about, and it was a lot of fun. A little bit of that, oh, I'm excited to go and learn, started coming back.
We started writing down just as questions. You know, what are the questions that you have? And then we prioritize the questions. There might be a science-related thing or English or history, but a lot of it was just following that question. And what's the next question?
They even took their education experiment on the road and visited 19 different states, still investigating all the questions that would come up. Isaiah began to understand that there's a big difference between schooling and education. That nightly ritual of processing feelings of sadness and frustration, crying, done, finished. Instead, Isaiah was growing a sense of curiosity and confidence in himself as a learner.
After his confidence was back up, then we began to start tackling more of like, how do we actually begin to build a foundation for reading?
Yeah.
And what are the ways in which people have learned to read, and which one do we want to go with? And we kind of chose that based on personality.
When it came to academic learning, especially reading, Jeremy did not try to do it alone. He leveraged the assets available in his community and his family. He got a lot of coaching from a good friend of the family named Barbara Antonopoulos, who had homeschooled her own 2 kids. Jeremy's mother, Sandra Lewis, was a reading specialist with decades of teaching experience, and she guided Jeremy as well and even tutored Isaiah herself once a week. Also, there was a church called St. Nicholas that was offering classes to kids in groups of 5 or 6. Taking those classes allowed Isaiah to experience learning with other kids again, but in a safer space where he would not be made to feel behind. And so for 2nd grade, Isaiah hit the ground running.
And that was just amazing to really watch the amount of time
It didn't take that much.
that it took with, intentionality and a process, really the one-on-one, the mentoring, the tutoring. It was super fast. I mean, the content that we covered, it was ridiculous.
This is when I really just started learning so much stuff.
Took off.
Yeah. And I went from having like a 1st grade knowledge to learning
Yeah.
4th grade math
Yeah.
in 1 year.
Yeah. I remember we were
In
done
1
with the
year.
Georgia standards that year. In 2nd grade, we were done with the Georgia standards, I think
Yeah.
by November.
Right.
We had already done everything that we needed to accomplish for the year. My mind was blown, really, that was possible. What would it be like if we actually did this in not a stressful way with kids? There's all kinds of possibility of things that people could be learning. I mean, I became a huge advocate that if he just had the opportunity to have a tutor or have someone who cared about you, these gains could happen. And
I think the biggest part with that though is the student-teacher ratio. Is because at Glenwood there was like 1 teacher for 25 kids.
We had a
25 kids.
para, 1 and a para, so two adults and 28.
Yeah, but at St. Nicholas, the max number of kids was like 5. And then when I was with him, it was 1-on-1. With that ability, I was able to ask questions whenever I wanted to and just learn rapidly. And that's when my confidence started to grow. I was like, it was so different than my Glenwood experience where I was told like, you aren't smart enough, to where I was like, oh wow, I do know these things. I can learn, and I am a good student.
The story of Isaiah's struggles in 1st grade illustrate the fragility of classroom teaching. Like I said, it's a delicate system where so many things can go wrong with it. And the story of Isaiah's experience with homeschooling illustrates something else: the resilience of tutoring. There's nothing normal or natural about the anguish that Isaiah was feeling just for being a bit different from his peers, who had attended the same school system for a bit longer than he had. We know this because his anguish disappeared the moment his family created a tutoring-based education for him. And we also know it from thousands of other stories of tutored children. One of the more famous ones is Helen Keller, who was famously deaf and blind. It's well known in modern America that being behind in second grade, which of course most second graders actually are behind, is a pretty good indicator that a child will never read on grade level. But not for Helen Keller. It's hard to imagine somebody who was more behind than Helen Keller was as a 7-year-old. She couldn't even speak. She had no oral language, which is supposed to be the foundation of all reading, according to the science of reading experts. Also, her behavior was disastrous. She was so frustrated and out of control that her uncle recommended to her parents that they just put her away in an institution for the insane and forget about her. But they didn't. Instead, they did the very best thing they could have done. They hired her a tutor, Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan started out trying to teach using the state-of-the-art teaching methods of that era, the methods that had been recommended for her by education experts. But they just didn't work. They enraged Helen even more. So, Anne adapted. Like Jeremy and Isaiah, they just went out on hikes together. They played games in the garden. Like Jeremy, Anne took the focus off of learning and focused on building a bond instead, learning more about Helen, discovering her interests. That was when the breakthroughs started to happen. And just like Isaiah, when the conditions were right for real teaching and learning to happen, watch out. With her tutor's support and her newfound love of learning, like Isaiah, Helen was able to quickly make up for all that lost time. With Anne Sullivan's continuous support, she made it through high school and college on her own timetable, not on some standardized schedule for when kids are supposed to go to high school and college. She did it on her own time and she crushed it. With Anne Sullivan by her side, Helen went from being one of the most behind second graders you can imagine to being one of the most educated people of her entire generation. Tutoring is just more resilient than classroom teaching because it's so flexible. When something isn't working, tutors can see it and adapt. There's no need for a tutored child to feel behind. That whole concept of being academically or behaviorally behind, it's just a modern invention. It comes from the challenges of teaching a whole class all at once. You kind of have to have standards. But outside of those pressures, it's actually very normal for kids to develop at different rates. Being below your peers in first grade or being a behavioral misfit doesn't say anything about a child's long-run potential. But it can cause trouble for teachers when they need kids to be a certain way to make the whole system work. Educators don't want to make kids feel behind, but they need to make their classrooms work. And for that system to work, there are certain academic and behavioral requirements kids need to meet. When I was a school leader, I dealt with many kids like Isaiah and Helen Keller who were feeling sad and frustrated. They lashed out too. But I could not tell their teachers to just adapt to the child. Take a while to just go out and relax and build trust and experiment, see what the child is curious about, play games. What would the rest of the class do? I couldn't say that. Our position was by necessity that the child needed to adapt. Since our system was only flexible to a very limited degree, it was the child and the family who were in the wrong. And so those kids did not normally get to experience what Isaiah and Helen did, these exciting moments of rapid learning that filled them with confidence and curiosity and healed them. The child's inability to conform to the norm can be stressful and even traumatic, but having a tutor who is willing and able to adapt to the child instead of forcing the child to conform can make all the difference. Eventually, Isaiah went back to public school, and this time things went very different.
I now knew that I had all these tools that I could use. I came in with a bunch of confidence that I was prepared to go back in, and I knew how to work. And if I didn't know how to do something, I had the tools to be able to figure out how to do it, how to ask the right questions, and to learn it well.
So Looking back on this whole thing, what kind of difference do you think it made to you that your dad was willing to do this?
Oh, it's pretty much changed my life. If he hadn't done that, I don't know where I would be right now. And even though he had to make such a big sacrifice for me, but when he did that, I realized that I it just reinforced how much he cared, that he would sacrifice his whole career, his job that he had been working at for a really long time just for our education. And that helped me realize how important your education was and learning how to learn, and also made me realize that I need to focus on this. And that's helped me to this day, taking school seriously, using my resources, my teachers, and my parents.
I learned a lot too, which is also one of the great benefits of being involved in that process is it gave me confidence in knowing that real things can change in a system that, is hard to change.
Even though this story ends happily for Isaiah and his family, it's also left them keenly aware of their privilege. Isaiah's transformation has given them both a sense that something more is possible in education.
I definitely feel empathy for certain kids because I see it a lot where there are people they're very smart, but they don't believe it yet, and they're kind of scared of what would happen if they try to apply themselves because they've just kind of accepted that okay, they're not going to be a great student.
And that kind of stuff, it makes me want to start a school because it really is possible. And the transformation, like the amount of stored up energy that's inside of each
Kids want to learn.
possibility of each child and person to create and to solve problems and to do things that we can't even imagine. I would equate it to a similar analogy to the stored seed of a sequoia or a massive tree that starts off as this tiny little seed that then can do just unbelievable things for the earth. That's present in each and every one of us. And it just has to be nurtured and find the right soil. And so educators have a huge opportunity, but we're all educators and we have the opportunity to engage in a society that participates in a way that opens people up rather than shuts them down.
I've really enjoyed listening to you guys reflect about this. Thanks for making the time.
Yes, thank you too.
Well, thanks for asking us
Yes, thank
about
you.
it and let us have a chance to share. I hadn't even thought about some of those
Yeah, me
things in a
too.
long time. It's really cool.
At the end of the interview, I'd like to offer my 2 cents about what we've learned from our experts and how it informs the central question of this podcast. What would it take to unleash our superpower? What would it take to free future generations from these serious limits that come from just the logic of large classes? This inflexibility, the inability to adapt to the child. These absurd and unnecessary but all important labels of being behind or supposedly above grade level. What would it take for future generations to be propelled by the logic of tutoring instead, which is the way we evolved to really be good at teaching and learning? I think Isaiah's example illustrates one of the important powers of tutoring that is not as well researched and not as commonly understood these days. The word tutor itself comes from the Latin word tuere, which doesn't mean to teach. It means to protect. This is because back in ancient Greece and Rome, tutors were commonly appointed by upper-class parents to educate and watch over important children. The story of Isaiah's education helps me to understand how the word for private teacher and the word for protector can become somewhat synonymous. As much gratitude as I feel towards the institution that we call school today, it concerns me that school is actually what Isaiah needed protection from. I think it's fair to say that the way we organize schooling today does not put our teachers in a strong position to truly protect our children. None of Isaiah's teachers were bad teachers or bad people. None of them wanted Isaiah to feel inadequate or not smart enough, sad and frustrated to the point of tears. They just weren't in a position to really protect him. Or as Jeremy put it,
He wasn't the top priority, which is also understandable. Lots of kids in a school, but he's my top priority.
And so it fell to Jeremy and Beth to protect Isaiah. And this is not unusual. This has happened millions of times. Homeschool is the fastest growing mode of education in America right now. And protecting children from something troubling happening at school is listed as the number one reason for parents to opt for homeschooling. But only 5% of kids are being homeschooled, and some of them are not being homeschooled very well. This cannot be our society's solution to the fragility and the extreme delicacy of the classroom system that can go wrong in so many ways. Because most parents, however much they love their children, are just not in a position to intervene as effectively as Jeremy and Beth did to protect their child, fix the problem. The ability to use tutoring to protect children who need it is still pretty much a question of privilege, like it was in ancient Greece and Rome thousands of years ago. Most parents cannot just quit their job or even go part-time to just focus on this. Not every parent has the confidence in themselves to believe that they can do better for their child than all those college-educated professionals down at the local school. Most parents don't have the community of supporters that Jeremy and Beth had to make sure this intervention was successful. Because of the ineffectiveness of our current system, most parents don't have the literacy or math skills that they would need to do what Jeremy did for his child. As long as the system relies so heavily on parents intervening when things go wrong, nothing will really change. It's asking a lot to expect parents who themselves may not have had good protection when they were growing up to become highly effective protectors their children might need. And so we all turn our heads away. There are children right down the street from me as I record this podcast who are struggling in school just like Isaiah was. For thousands of reasons, they're not able to be what the system needs them to be. Some of them are facing milder versions of the same kind of struggle. But for some kids, it's far more severe. And me, I'm not protecting them. Even though I know what would change their lives, and even though I'm a member of their community, I do nothing. What would I sacrifice for them? If my own child were really struggling, like Isaiah, I would probably sacrifice a lot to protect their education and their confidence, belief in themselves.
Virtually all Americans love their own children, but too few of them love other people's children.
What would I do for a child who is not my own child? Just like in the early 19th century and the early 20th century, we are being asked that question again. Education is not some hard, impossible project that we don't know how to solve. We know what would actually work, but it's expensive. So, what would it take for us to unleash our superpower? We will have to feel just as protective of all the children in our communities as Jeremy and Beth felt about Isaiah. We will have to be willing to sacrifice for other people's children once again. Sacrifice more for them than was ever sacrificed for us. Not sacrifice as much as Jeremy and Beth did. Still, a bit more than 4% of our money will have to go towards our community's schools if we want to give each child something truly life-changing. Tutoring instead. The resilient, not fragile mode of teaching. We will have to remember how to do something our ancestors did for us. People we never met, who we're not biologically related to, who were themselves poor and poorly educated by our standards, paid for the system that educated us. It's never been perfect, but it's a lot better than what they had. To unleash our superpower, we're just going to have to pay it forward. And that's my 2 cents. Do you have stories about not fitting the mold? Not able to be the person your school system expected you to be? Please don't hesitate to reach out and share your stories. Thanks for listening, and stay in touch.